I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap.
So I'm Ed Sterling, I'm from Bolton, lifelong railroad fan. I grew up in Essex Junction, Vermont. The name itself hints at railroading. They had a wonderful barn, train barn in Essex Junction years ago, where the passengers would get off and they were covered from the snow by this wonderful barn. So that's a huge memory as a kid. I remember the steam engines back in the day, and the fellow would pull the water spout down to fill up the tender and so on. It was a great childhood up there. And so we had big Lionel train layouts in our house everywhere we moved. My poor father in his later years set up a great big Lionel layout down at his retirement home, and it was a real achievement. So I just kind of love railroads. When I moved here, I noticed a lot of strange tracks left in the asphalt. All around Hudson, and of course coming down Route 62 here in Berlin, you'd look up and you'd see the little ridge there with the old rusty rails and so on. And then finally at Five Corners, the old bridge abutments that sit there as a monument to the railroading of the past. And then people were telling me about a tunnel in Clinton. It was like a tunnel, seriously, in Clinton. Sure enough, there was a tunnel made when the dam came in. Okay, so that's my quick background again. Big railroad fan, and I've given a lecture on the whole history of the railroad that went through from Boston to Northampton, and I'm going to try to do an abbreviated version of that for our fourth talk. All right, that gives you the whole scope. Today, I'm just going to try to limit it to the nearby stations, and we'll talk about the other railroad that it was not part of the main one that's just up the street. What came through Berlin was called the Massachusetts Central Railroad. There was a railroad fever, if you will, after the Civil War. And you have to think back. I mean, what did people have? They had horse and wagons to get goods to market. All right, that was it. So if your town didn't have a railroad, you were going nowhere. So every town wanted to have a railroad. And so in 1869, after the Civil War, there was a petition in the court to build a railroad through the center of Massachusetts, and it was called the Central Massachusetts Central Railroad. And so there's a general idea of it weaving its way from Boston through Sudbury and Wayland into Hudson and Clinton, then on to Rutland, all the little towns, Quinnipoxet, Bondsville, Gilbertsville, down to Belchertown, Amherst, and finally Northampton. Something like 120 miles, if I'm not mistaken. And that was the plan. That was the plan. So they got it going, and it kind of fell on its face. So there were many attempts over the years to have a railroad in the center of Massachusetts. And so there they had a capitalization of $3 million. And that was a lot of money in those days. But to build a railroad from scratch, wow. I mean, you look at these abutments here along Route 62, the labor involved in building those up, to get a good, stable track bed. Just amazing. All the different towns were basically expected to buy shares in the railroad to come up with that $3 million, and everybody did. There were towns that defaulted. So they got from out to Hudson in October of 1881, and then they went bankrupt. After they went bankrupt, they restored themselves, they got more money, and they went out to Little Jefferson, which is by Holden. They then reincorporated, and they called it the Central Mass Railroad. They switched the name, and they got out to little old Jefferson again. So finally, in 1887, after many years of work, they finally got this 104 miles, and there's the map as they went from Boston through all the different little towns. You can see Clinton, you can see Sudbury, and so on, working their way down kind of under what would become the Quabbin. Hadn't been built yet, thank goodness, and they went out to Northampton. So a lot of work. There's a wonderful book called The Central Mass that gives the story of how the railroad was built in the history and so many pictures. That book was very difficult to find, but luckily somebody reprinted it in 2008, and now it's a very approachable, as opposed to $150. Now it's about $40. So that's my Bible, if you will, for the documentation and the pictures of this Central Mass Railroad. This is the kind of engine you would have seen up until 1956, when the steam engine service went out of existence. So a long run. This is the kind of passenger car you would have sat in those days. The Boston and Maine had kind of a rusty maroon color for their passenger cars. That's actually a little model, believe it or not. To keep down the cost, they started to run doodlebugs, gasoline-powered passenger cars with a driver in front, and they had the nickname of a doodlebug, so it was a lot cheaper than a great big locomotive with a fireman and a conductor and everybody else. And so essentially it was like a trolley car on the main line. And those were replaced eventually by what we call bud cars. RDC is kind of the nomenclature, rail diesel car. Same story, there's a driver up in front, and it's a passenger car fundamentally, and there were different versions that had post offices built into them and baggage compartments and things like that. So that would have been the kind of wagon you would have seen in the last days of service here in Berlin. So as you went down from Boston, you'd see there's a few little stations that are left. That's Weston, and that poor station is still floating around. I contacted the historical people, and they're trying to save it, but it's in very bad shape. All those weeds now are all gone, with a beautiful paved rail bed for a rail trail. So there's a lot of rail trail activity on this railroad today, and there's high hopes that it might come through Berlin at some point. Continuing on from Weston, you would have had little country stations like this called Tower Hill. That disappeared long ago. That was in Wayland. And here we are in Wayland today. You can see, unfortunately, a busy group of commuters with the engine coming into Boston. He's going toward Boston at this point. And obviously commuting service was very popular in those days. Then in 1970, it kind of goes down to nothing. And we just have a few people making that very last run. The next year in 1971, all the passenger service ended on this line, and that was the end. The little station still exists. It's beautiful. It's on Route 27, down by Route 20, and it's kind of like a little gift shop, kind of craft store that's open quite frequently, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So Wayland has done a great job in keeping their station. As you went on from there, you went to South Sudbury. You can see there's a crossing right there in the middle. So there was a track that came down from up north, up in Concord, and that too they're trying to convert into a rail trail. And there we are. So there's one of those bud cars kind of sitting on the siding for the night, and then that'll start up again and make another trip into Boston. As you got into Hudson, there was a crossover at what they call Wilkinsville Bridge or Skeeterville. So the track from up in Maynard is the lower track, and the track that's coming from Sudbury is the upper track. And that bridge is gone, but the abutments are there. So if you're a fan of the rail trail, as soon as you park your car in East Hudson, you'll see those two great big abutments that are holding the bridge up. And those are the remainders of that. The tracks, again, are still intact in the woods. It's remarkable. So you would have gone to Hudson Station on your way to Berlin. And this is when it was in pretty good shape, 1931. 2 tracks, which is surprising. Then it kind of goes downhill a little bit. 1950, the train is headed now toward Berlin. And there's the little Hudson Station behind it. In downtown Hudson, there was actually a second station, all right? That lower track we saw a moment ago, that now is a Shell station and a subway and an insurance company. So that station disappeared a long time ago, probably around 1960, early 1960s. And that was the track that went to Marlboro, and that's the rail trail today that's so popular in Hudson, that goes through Hudson, goes up the hill, and goes into the part of Marlboro. But it was all what they call the B&M Railroad, the Boston and Maine Railroad in those days. And there was all kinds of tracks. It's remarkable how many there were. The next stop was a little country station in Bolton. It's called South Bolton. Again, it's remarkable to think that there were 2 tracks because there's almost no evidence of it anywhere. Today it's all grown in with swampland. And it was a little station. So they had a little freight platform, and you could flag down the train. And there's a bridge in the back where the trolley went over the railroad track. You can see kind of an X in black. And the trolley on Central Street went over the railroad, and it must have been quite a ride to go way up in the air and down. That station was moved right around World War II and is now a home in Bolton on South Bolton Road. They moved it a couple hundred feet. So continuing on, pretty much where the mall would be today, probably taken from Route 62, here is a typical, what I call end of the line freight, the engine and the caboose, and probably one boxcar full of lumber for Caldwell Lumber hanging in the back. And these would have been the very last trains. 74, 75 was the end. So here we are right up the street on Highland by Mary Porter's house is the Little Berlin Village Station, as cute as can be. And there's a number of tracks that are down out of the picture. I think the switch post that you can see in the front with the lamp is still there. So it's all grown in. That's Mrs. Porter's house in the back. And here's a typical winter scene, and it's amazing how clear and open it is. And all that had to be shoveled by hand, which must have been very difficult. And look at how open it is, going all the way down toward the Five Corners. It's remarkable. All grown in now. Here's just another scene in the wintertime. This poor man is shoveling the snow by hand. And now it's looking kind of sad. Even in 1938, the Depression's been pretty hard, I guess, on the passenger traffic. And so it's looking like it's pretty much abandoned, doesn't it? Pretty sad. A lot of those stations disappeared after the Depression. Passenger service went way down. Many branch lines closed all over New England, never to run again. Here we would be on Route 62 today, and there's the bridge abutment where the old bridge was. So here, let's take a look at the bridge. And there you are. So quite a truss system. You can see the stone abutments there under that crisscross pattern. You see the bridge on top of the rails there. We see something like a mill behind the tree on the left side. And the railroad going here, there's tracks, is the trolley system. And the trolley went up to the Daniel's liquor store, which was the generating house. They ran on electricity. And so the liquor store today was the generator back then for the trolleys that went all the way back down into Maynard. It's a little clearer. It was redone a little bit. And so here you are kind of up on the hill on Linden, looking basically to the north. You can see the span there. And again, some type of mill, I think, in the foreground. There's a creek that runs, and there was a mill pond on the other side of something called Carter's Sawmill. So what you have is a popular map that was made back in like around 1896. And curiously, there's a diagonal line there going across the stream. And there's a connector that was made between the Berlin main track, east-west, to the northbound railroad. And try to find that today. And it's mentioned in text. There's no pictures of it, and it's unclear if it was ever actually constructed. It may have been constructed but never used. One gentleman who seems to be an expert on the subject thought it was a freight connector, but the freight agreements never really got signed between the two different railroads. So the plan was there for it.
The bed of that track is there.
Can you still see it?
Oh, yeah.
Was it Pollard Road? There's a development going in now.
Say that.
Pollard Road. Pollard is a new development right at the Five Corners.
Yeah, well, it starts about there.
Yes.
It goes around, and then it stops. There's no indication of a button.
Downhill or something? Yeah. The grade is quite substantial. So how freight cars could have safely gone down the hill, if you will, into the other line, I don't quite understand. But what we see on top is what was called Carter's. Again, Carter's Sawmill. So that was the station on the New Haven line. And that line had many names. It was called Agricultural Branch. It was called the Old Colony. It got bought by the New Haven Railroad out of New York City. And finally today it's CSX, which is what you see for most of the engines around here. The big blue engines with the yellow CSX. So it went through many hands. And yet the one going through Berlin is the Boston and Maine Railroad, all right? So a lot of competition in those days. And we see kind of a repeat of some of the photographs we had of going up to the bridge. There's the bridge over the little Carter station. And I think there were actually two. There's a man standing in the middle picture by a tiny little hut. And then if you look at this bigger station over here, I believe that was on the liquor store side. So I think there might have been two Carter's stations based on different times and the amount of passengers that might have gotten on at that point. Okay, probably not too many. So there's a close-up of it. And if I'm not mistaken, we're looking toward Clinton to the left and Berlin Center toward the right. Here's one of those doodle bugs, and it actually has a car attached to it. So it's going toward Berlin Center. And again, you can kind of see the roads are pretty clear at that point. I'm not sure if that house still exists, frankly. That'd be a good test, wouldn't it? But these were the kind of glory days. This would have been probably about 1948. Those silver cars hadn't been invented yet. The steam service, again, was expensive to run a few passengers, you know, to have a steam engine all the way out to Clinton like that. So this was a pretty cost-efficient type of operation that ran on a gasoline engine. So I ran into other pictures, and I often thought that was the little junk shop that became a real estate office in the last couple of years, right there at the West Berlin Junction. It's not. To the best of my knowledge, it's down on Jones Road, where you have that kind of fancy, you come up, you make the left turn, then you make the hard right, and you go up eventually to Linden so you can get down to Five Corners. So this was called Berlin Station, or South Berlin, and this is an old topographical map from way back, this is almost before the tunnel and everything else. You can see where this Berlin station would have been, and that, I believe, is the picture of that little depot. Wow. It doesn't resemble the one down here at the center at all right? So that's the only explanation. That's called South Berlin, if you will. Before the reservoir came, you had stations that literally would eventually be drowned by the reservoir. So you had what they called South Clinton, Boylston. These photographs are just so clear. Thousands and thousands of photographs were taken when the dam was created, and they're all online today. 8,000 photographs. Every aspect of building that dam and the railroad is online. And these are all gone now. These are all underwater. And then West Boylston. So it's 1896. They know the reservoir is coming, and they have to do something about the railroad because it's going to run right through the middle of the reservoir, and it has to be relocated. So they, down at Five Corners, instead of going straight, they made a hard right turn, and they went up the road to Clinton. And you have that Woodlands housing project. So it went there, and it eventually went behind Rue's Garage, and it finally kind of curved and turned into what they call the clamshell. All right? And at the clamshell, they dug a tunnel 1,100 feet long by hand. I mean, this was tough labor in those days. So there's the steam engine coming out of the east, coming toward Berlin from Clinton, and there's the west one. And that's where, well, apparently the tunnel is marked to become part of a proposed rail trail. And I believe just recently it's been fenced off so that people can't go in there. I guess they're doing studies on the viability and the structural capability of the tunnel that's now, 120 years old. It's remarkable. So that's the plan. So that's been freshly constructed. Today there'd be all kinds of trees. There's homes up on the hill on Wilson Street and so on. This is a great picture. The dam is being built in the background. You can see the cranes. So they had to do something with the railroad first to solve that problem, because it still was important back in those days. Again, it's 1900. The dam is built from about 1900 to 1905, but they had to solve the railroad problem first before they could flood and start creating the dam. So there it is under construction way back. I think in fact it says December of 1903. So beautiful picture of what they call the viaduct. That was the name of the trestle, the viaduct. And so here you are on the dam with that beautiful garden down below with the spray in the circle. And there you have the viaduct. The viaduct lasted until 1975, and it was then taken down by an ironworks fellow, I think named Fuller from Bolton. And I think he did the job for the cost of the value of the scrap steel. And there you are from the plane. You can see the viaduct, you can see the dam, the river all dammed up in the back. And this was really something to have created a reservoir of that size. So it's finished. The picture is 1960. The dam became viable back around 1908, I think. It actually filled up finally. But even at that point, they realized that the Wachusett Reservoir was not going to be enough to satisfy Boston's water needs. And so the planning for the quabbin occurred very shortly thereafter in the 1920s. And it was very soon thereafter they basically took the land, the 4 little towns disappeared, and by 1938 everything had been cleared out. The towns were basically decertified or something, whatever you do with a town to take it out by the state, sadly. And then they began the dam at Belchertown, and it filled up around 1946. Okay, and I think it's the largest freshwater reservoir in the world. It was one of our doodlebugs, and that's entering the tunnel going toward Berlin. So there's the tunnel today. Look at all the woods. But again, right now there's all kinds of paint that kids have vandalized and spray painted, and then again they put up a fence because they say they're going to intend to use it for a rail trail. When you finally got over to Clinton, you would have had to loop around the current Clinton High School, all right? So as soon as you crossed over that rickety viaduct, all right, and you crossed in front of the dam, the switch was thrown either to continue to Worcester or the switch was thrown to go into Clinton. And you made a big curve right through the middle of what is today the Clinton High School, and you looped up into downtown Clinton, and that's the depot that's still there in the center of Clinton. And that was called the WNNP, the Worcester, Nashua, and Portland Railroad. That was going north-south out of Worcester up to Portland. So if you ever try the rail trail up in air, you'll see things like W35, Worcester 35 miles, or P for Portland. You'll see like P113, 113 miles up to Portland on that track. So once you got into Clinton from Berlin, this is what you would have seen. There was the old turntables, because locomotives, it's a heck of a thing to run a locomotive back how many miles. So the turntable was the way of getting the locomotive turned around in those days. And you also see one of those doodle bugs just kind of on the right side there, and we have a train getting ready to go either down to Worcester or back to Boston in the background. That today is all kinds of warehouses, I think, in Clinton. There's a McDonald's and so on in that area, long gone. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit, the last train that was a steam engine was in May of '56. And that locomotive, 1455, was saved. It went down to Edaville, the famous little tourist railroad down by the cranberry bogs. It just sat there on display. You kids could climb up into it. It had various lives after that, and finally it's been saved, and it's at what they call the New England Railroad Museum in Danbury, Connecticut. And of course everybody says it's going to be restored someday, but what we need is Bill Gates or Warren Buffett to come up with the money. The last passenger train to Clinton was in May of 1958. And there's a page in Reverend Crackhart's History of Berlin where he devotes a chapter to that last ride. I think it was like May 13th of 1958. Apparently all the families went up to the station up here, and the kids piled onto one of those silver RDC cars, and they took a ride over to Clinton, and then apparently all the parents had to drive over and pick them up. For whatever reason, my understanding is they called it deadhead. They ran the car backwards back to Boston empty, I guess for railroad regulation reasons, who knows. So the bridge that we see down at West Berlin Five Corners, that was taken down in 1960. The tracks beyond into Clinton were all removed. The tracks end there and are still there in the woods to this day. So that, to some extent, is an attraction for these fellas that come in to help build rail trails. They get all the steel, and I don't know if there's value in the railroad ties after all this time, but the steel has some value, and I think that's usually part of the contract. They take the rails away. Passenger service keeps keeps diminishing. So 58 in Berlin, the end. 65, the last passenger train to Hudson, and that was for that bigger station that we saw in the picture, the kind of the old one with the big tower and turret. That was the end of that station. They tried to keep things going to South Sudbury till 1971. There was an appeal to keep it going. We promised to ride more, and nobody did. And so in November of '71, they ended all the passenger service to Sudbury. The only other curious thing that happened on the railroad was there was a wedding train, and a fellow with a lot of money went up to Vermont to a tourist railroad in, I think it was Bellows Falls, and he contracted to have an engine and 2 cars come down to Boston from Bellows Falls to transport a wedding party. So apparently the big wedding reception was at the wayside. So I guess they got the train to that point, and then a bunch of cars came along and transported all the guests down to the wayside for the reception. And so people were amazed to hear a steam locomotive, whistling at night as this train, I guess, came in or was being parked for the evening and then basically went back up to Vermont. And so there's a number of photographs of this so-called wedding train in Wayland in 1973. I mean, years and years after steam service was allowed to run. The very last train that I know of, there was a little, what they call a fan trip. And 4 of those silver bud cars, as they call them, 4 of them were ganged together, and they had a rail fan trip in October of '73 that would have gone from Boston all the way out to Central Mass through all the old stations and eventually stopped in Berlin, which is really the end of what they call the safe tracks. But even at that, I guess railroad officials were alarmed at how bad the track conditions were. So they got as far as Berlin. I think they had a little rest stop, and back they went. And I think they toured 1 or 2 other now abandoned tracks, like up in Bedford, the Minuteman Trail. All right. So that was quite a trip to be on, and I wish I'd have been there, to tell you the truth. And the B&M Railroad said, we just can't, for insurance reasons, have any more of these trips. So that was the end of these so-called fan trips. And so that was the end of seeing any passenger cars on the railroad here. And there it is. It was taken, that picture was taken, I think, in Bear Hill, that little mountain with all the microwaves in Waltham. And that's Route 128 down below. So you can see the cars all ganged up here. Freight service ran for a few more years after that. February '75 would have been the last delivery to Coldwell's with lumber. We saw that 1 engine and caboose and the lonely boxcar. Some freights got into Hudson in June of 1980, and then they stopped the service around August. Apparently there was a secret run by a train crew. They loved to go to the bar lunch in Hudson, and apparently they got the idea. I'm sorry?
They had great food.
Did they really? Well, I guess the track condition was good enough to get an engine, so apparently they kind of off the books. This train crew got out there and took one last ride off the books just to enjoy lunch at the bar lunch.
They probably also used it to put coal at Knight's Fuel Company.
Yes, yeah.
They dumped the coal there.
There were all kinds of tracks apparently going in there, that many of which are gone now.
I lived across the street.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I wish I had photographs. I wish. All right, so in September 1980, the whole rail system from Waltham out was decommissioned, and really it's never been run since. The track conditions are just awful. But funny, the rails are all still there, and so that's one of the enticements, as I say, for these rail trails, to be able to recover some of that steel, I guess, is part of the cost. And that's the plan for the rail trail today. It's in pretty good shape in Weston and Wayland. Sudbury is fighting it because they are against the electrical lines apparently being buried in or beside the rail trail. Hudson has got the nice rail trail from the east side of town going all the way over to Marlboro. Okay, and there's that nice blue caboose that you see on Main Street. But the question is, will they reactivate in some way this line out to Berlin as a rail trail and so on? So the fact that they're thinking about using the tunnel again is pretty amazing. I mean, it seems to be serious enough that they are committed to getting that rail trail to come out this way and continue all the way on out to Northampton. I mean, that's the plan. So you can see there's some red of hoping that someday it'll happen. The green says it's been created, and I think the yellow is sort of under agreement for future studies. So it may be that someday you'll be able to take the trail all the way out on its original route. That appears to be the end of the line for all of us. So you've got a sense of sort of the breadth of the system and what it was like here in Berlin to have those two lines, the north-south, what they call New Haven or Old Colony, which still exists today, of course. That's a live line. But again, if you kind of go down to 5 corners, the condition of the track is very questionable. I mean, it's really wavy, so I don't know that it gets much attention as the trains come up into Clinton. Again, the Central Mass was never a really successful railroad, and so once the Depression hit, you can see the passenger service really diminished a lot. A lot of railroads had a little brief spike during World War II. I mean, that was the way we won the war, so to speak, by having the railroads being able to transport the troops all across the country and get supplies. So the railroads did well, relatively speaking, but it really took a lot out of them in terms of the pounding that the locomotives and the boxcars and everything else took of that constant defense role that it played. And then after the war, most of the equipment was in really, really bad shape. And so it was a gamble after the war as to whether the railroads were going to put money back in hoping for more more passenger service and transportation, with the economy booming at that point after the war. But now you had these pilots and these new things called jets and 4-engine planes. And so all of a sudden transportation became so much more popular, and the rails really never recovered. So most passenger service really started to fade very much in the early 1950s. Those are kind of the last of the passenger service days. You get to about 1955 and the revenue goes way, way down on most railroads. And so sadly today, most of it disappeared. Today you still have Amtrak, but it's very expensive apparently to ride the Amtrak. It's more than air service in many cases, but some people don't like to fly, so it becomes an alternative. But it's pretty expensive, and sadly, I track it. You can track the progress of trains and stuff all over the internet, and the trains are hours and hours late. Day after day after day. There's so many issues. I think perhaps because the rail traffic is actually so good. So for the freight traffic, so the freight is doing very well. I think the passenger service takes second place, and there's probably one of the reasons that you have a lot of delays of Amtrak passenger service. This is one of those things. Well, you all remember Pan Am, the airline. Well, the funny thing is, Pan Am sadly went bankrupt after that famous horrible incident in Scotland where the Libyan bombers put the bomb in the plane. Lockerbie, Scotland it was called. And Pan Am never really recovered from that, and they eventually went bankrupt. That famous globe with the latitude and longitude lines, that was their symbol, and the name Pan Am was bought by the successor railroad of the Boston and Maine. So the Boston and Maine collapsed around 1983. They went through a number of different Chapter 11s and Chapter 7s. It got turned over to something called Guilford Rail. Guilford bought the rights to the Pan Am logo and then the font and the colors and the blue. And now if you go up to air, you'll see these Pan Am boxcars, and you think to yourself, it looks like a 747. Well, it is the same logo, and everything was purchased legally as a trademark. And so that's the current railroad you see up in air on that north-south, east-west line coming out of Boston is called the Pan Am Railways. I heard even that name may change to something else at this point. So it's funny how these different railroads come and go. As I say, in the west side of Berlin now, CSX is the active line that goes north and south at this point. And you have to go up to air to see the Pan Am Railway, which is sort of the new line we have for freight service. MBTA locally, of course, runs the passenger service out of Boston, and Amtrak I think goes south down to New York City, and I think there may be some trains that go up to Maine at this point. So just gives you an idea of what's left.
Amtrak goes to went to Washington D.C.
Yes, Yes.
We went from Framingham
Is that right?
to DC.
My parents tried that one year and they had this like 7-hour delay. They said, never again. I think it was a Christmas time, so who knows what the issues may have been, but it wasn't the best experience for them. When I was a kid, the steam engines up in Essex Junction, Vermont, they were either called the Montrealer going to Canada or the Washingtonian going down to Washington. They would go through New York City down to Washington D.C. on the old steam locomotives, and that was a great memory for me. Shows how old I am.